Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you to everyone, all of our online viewers, for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Events here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. And we are very excited to introduce today's presentation of the round-the-clock third-party advantage. We'll be discussing what you need to assess vendors in the modern cyber environment, providing you with the right map to assess your external risk. Our presenters for today's session are Brandon Dobrec, our award-winning product manager here at LookingGlass, and we have a special guest co-presenter. We have Paul Roberts, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Security Ledger. That is an independent security news website that explores the intersection of cybersecurity with the Internet of Things. Paul is a seasoned reporter, editor, and industry analyst with more than a decade of experience covering the information technology security space. Before we begin, I want to very quickly run through a few housekeeping notes and reminders for the Bright Talk webinar platform for our audience. Please note on the screen that there is a chat window where you should feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters. We'll be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run short on time to go through all the submitted questions, we'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation, so don't be shy. We'll make sure that all your questions get addressed. And please note, any questions that are submitted through this chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments and we'll contact you directly if desired. Also note, we have an attachments and links section on your audience screen. We've got some great resources for you to peruse at your convenience relevant to today's topic. And then lastly, and very importantly, if anyone would like to obtain 1 hour of CPE credit toward your professional certification for viewing today's webcast and didn't happen to enter your membership number when you signed up, please send it to us via the chat window. All you have to do is simply enter your membership number and only, and Bright Talk will tell us which viewer it came from. You can enter it at any time during the webcast. So now, without any other further delay at this time, let's go ahead and I'm going to pass this over to our presenters to kick off the webcast. So Paul, please take us away.
Hey everybody, thanks very much. And thank you for that nice introduction. I'm Paul Roberts and I'm the editor-in-chief at the Security Ledger. We're an independent cybersecurity news website. Way of promotion, let me just say that if you are interested in our podcast, email newsletters, and so on, just go to securityledger.com/subscribe and sign up for recruitment. So I'm really thrilled to be here and talking with Brandon about third-party risk. This is a topic that we at the Security Ledger have been writing about in various forms right along. And increasingly, as third-party risk and third-party attacks have become more and more prominent, and really encompass a wide range of issues. I think the best way, rather than to sort of talk about third-party risk at the 100,000-foot level, is to talk about a specific incident that's happened, within the last couple of years that I think really highlights the stakes here for organizations around third-party and business partner risk. And the example we decided to use was the NotPetya attack, which was, of course, a devastating cyber attack that happened in June of 2017. You probably remember this or read about it either at the time or after. This is a very rapid worldwide outbreak of a piece of malware that has become known as NotPetya. Initially, people thought it was a existing type of malware named Petya, and thus the name NotPetya. And what was really interesting about this was, first of all, how widely it spread, and also how it spread. So the initial spreading vector by which the malware ended up on victim networks was through an update, a software update, or what looked like a software update for a rather obscure piece of really bookkeeping, kind of QuickBooks type software called MEDoc.
that was made by a Ukrainian company, and not surprisingly, was used mostly by Ukrainian companies, firms. And the kind of initial attack vector came in the form of a signed update, so a properly signed update from the MEDOC servers. The problem is, of course, that the company that makes MEDOC had been compromised, its network compromised by advanced threat actors, its update server taken over, and a malicious program made to look like a MEDOC update. So this got pushed out to MEDOC customers, downloaded, and executed because it looked to be a signed legitimate software update to a legitimate application. And then once that happened, the sort of downloader application was installed, and additional malicious components were installed, including one that used an exploit called Eternal Blue that was part of the Vault 8 release. This was a NSA offensive hacking tool, basically. Exploited a Microsoft Windows vulnerability that was known, but still in many cases unpatched within enterprise networks. And this allowed the malware to basically canvas and exploit any other vulnerable systems on networks. So it spread very rapidly. And it's believed that the attack was designed to cripple private sector firms and organizations within Ukraine, but of course it sort of jumped the fence very quickly and ended up affecting a much wider array of companies, including some very large firms, FedEx, Mondelez, which is a candy maker, Merck Pharmaceuticals, and AP Moller Maersk, the global shipping giant. The Maersk attack in particular has been the subject of a really detailed profile by Andy Greenberg at Wired that I would recommend all of you read if you haven't already. And the financial damages, which really talks about how that outbreak more or less crippled the company, both infecting and wiping critical systems, and then just needing to shut down any other systems in order to prevent the spread of the malware. And it left that shipping company really running on pen and paper and clipboards for quite a while as they dug out from that. The damages to the company directly were around $300 million, and really needed to rebuild huge parts of their internal network to recover. And that's the damages they sort of reported. That's what they've said publicly. Of course, there could be much higher damages depending on how you look at it. Globally, NotPetya is estimated to have cost $10 billion in damages. I know here in the United States, Merck Pharmaceuticals, for example, had to stop production of a critical HPV vaccine and actually dip into some stockpiles of the vaccine that they keep on supply for the U.S. government in order to meet customer orders as a result of the NotPetya outbreak. That's Gardasil is the name of the vaccine. And so, it had a real, as we're seeing increasingly, real kind of cyber physical impact, and very, very damaging. Third-party risks really take a number of forms, and we're going to talk about some of them. Brandon is going to drill down, but at a high level, I think, if you look across these various incidents of third-party compromises, the main way that these tend to manifest themselves are, as with NotPetya, so malware spreading from third-party networks or via third-party connections, so the MEDOCs update. The other is increasingly attacks or compromises that come by way of cloud-based or managed service providers. And there have been some very prominent instances of APT-style actors or even cyber criminals compromising MSPs, managed service providers, and using their access to those networks to then target their ultimate victim, which is the customer network, hiding under the good reputation and trusted relationship of the MSP. And then kind of at the more kind of pedestrian or common level is just spear phishing and business email compromise attacks. Folks getting emails that look legitimate and clicking on a funky link, and that is what is causing them to get, the attackers get a foot in the door. There's some really interesting kind of details on each of these, and I'm gonna pass off to my good friend Brandon Dobrec, who's going to drill down on each of them and just give you a little bit more intel on things you might want to be looking for or considering. So Brandon, take it from here.
Awesome, thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As Paul mentioned, we'll be taking you through these three specific pieces of assessing our third parties for their risk and why our third parties are of risk to us. And then beyond that, we're going to go look at later on what you can do to prevent cyber risk coming from your third parties. Paul really took us down to the individual level. In this case, I'm going to take us back up to that 10,000-foot view and talk about sort of why our third parties are a risk for malware spread. So we saw in the previous NotPetya example, malware is being built more intelligently, and it's being built in such a way that can spread laterally through how interconnected our networks are. We are no longer the old days of base perimeter defense, where your log files and your IDS and your IPS were enough, but now we're at a point where our PII, our valuable data is kept outside of our walled gardens, and also where we're continuously giving more people access into our networks. Companies are actually allowing third parties various levels of access directly into their networks, and they're not even properly vetting them. So, a quote that I had from a customer fairly recently was, at any given time, we have hundreds or even thousands of vendors connecting to our web via VPN or connecting through the DMZ. But outside of knowing that the sessions are there, we don't do anything to even identify who it is. Now, this interconnectedness of networks is creating an inherent risk and a web through which things like malware can spread. So it is a legitimate concern because we are willingly opening ourselves up to this, and we are creating the possibility for attacks like the NotPetya to take place. Beyond this, there's sort of the single point of failure companies in our network. So within our supply chain, within our vendors, within our subsidiaries, there are companies that can be rightly described as single points of failure, whether they are the only supplier of a precious metal or a unique chemical, or they're a key stop in the petrochemical chain. And having a malware impact those individuals who are outside of our security controls and outside of our direct control can have tremendous amounts of impact on us as a company. In a truly timely example of this, that the Triton malware actually just came out. And it's attacking the ICS systems in petrochemical companies in the Middle East. So this is actually directly affecting the processing chain for oil. Now, these companies are not as large as the top-end oil providers. They're just steps in the supply chain. But when their ICS systems are affected, it can have a direct impact on the bottom line of these, gas and oil producers. So in both ways, one, from seeing how things can spread laterally to impact us, and also just understanding how our third parties can be impacted by malwares that they may not have controls to prevent, but we may have insight into. A malware can have a large impact on the third party environment. Next I'll be looking at is compromised services. So it is astonishing to me to this day that outside of phishing, the vast majority of breaches come from low-hanging fruit. In an era where both IT ops providers and analysts are somewhat understaffed, there's a bit of a Google it and fix it culture, and it can lead to misconfigurations if things are not set up correctly in the first place. And we see that constantly. We see simple things like, ports being open that aren't supposed to be open, or, services running, unpatched softwares. And it even comes down to situations where we can't patch the softwares because the things behind them or the things underlying them are critical, but are reliant on that unpatched software. An example I always give is the fact that the vast majority of the global clearinghouses for the Fiserv industry still run on COBOL. And unfortunately, COBOL is a rather vulnerable language. We see it in the SWIFT attacks that occur regularly, but there's nothing that we can do about it because we can't take those systems down and cut them over to a new language. That the relative cost to the globe would be just unbelievable. So in both of these cases, things that we willfully choose not to fix because we can't, and things that are just sort of left open, that they leave the possibility for entry. And again, in our third parties, our subsidiaries, our vendors that may not have the same level of due diligence, the same level of security maturity, it can be even harder to catch these things. So by auditing our vendors and allowing them to know that we are watching, we are seeing, we are taking an external view of them, we can, one, provide them with information around where their gaps lie, similar to how, we may have an alarm on the house, but if the doors and windows are all open, people can get in. But it also, it allows us to know where there's the potential for threats to spread to us. We can prioritize that based on where our PII lives, who has specific access to us, who holds critical information, or who is a key resource or a single point of failure. Beyond just the simple ones, things like Telnet and RDP and rsync and all of that, there's also now we're literally relying on cloud services. Things that our data just lives in an AWS bucket or lives on the Google App Engine or Microsoft Azure. And human error can lead to private company data being included on misconfigured repos and exposed servers. And it's not done in a malicious way. It's just in many ways willful ignorance. And we saw this in the Northman Grumop issue, where AWS keys were left on an exposed server. We saw this when key government information was left on an exposed AWS repo, an S3 one. So we need to be continuously watching for these human failings, because there are things that people might not even know that they have, and there are things that might not even show up on something like a survey or a point-in-time check, because people will say, oh, well, yes, I did it right, without even knowing that they are exposed and they are at risk. And the final one that I wanted to touch on was BEC. BEC is continuously and massively in vogue. I believe it was caused something like 350 million in total losses last year. But there's a really interesting piece that we're seeing on non-traditional BEC. So as opposed to going and causing BEC through actual phishing emails, people are using exposed resources to do it. So Cumry puts out their Dragon Bytes, which is a lovely read. And they recently had a great article on this new form of BEC, which is actually email exfiltration. So bad actors are actually capitalizing on those misconfigured services that I was talking about before, specifically ones like rsync, ones like RDP that give you access to a system and allow you to essentially copy what's on the drive or have insight into what's on the drive and copy pieces of it to exfiltrate documents. So they're actually searching through these repos for specific keywords like @AR, @accounts receivable, @accounting, @contracts. And without having to actually socially engineer a human, they're able to get the same level of detail with even greater ease. So, the direct quote was, careless backups of email archives on publicly accessible rsync, FTP, SMB, S3, everything, expose some 12.5 million archive files from a whole slew of mail servers. So taking it down to a specific example, bring it back to a little bit more of the ground level, we can say, what if we use Capgemini for our accounts receivable? Well, I can see the company, let's say lgc.capgemini.com site. I can do a check against its publicly exposed ports, and if knowing that they are a company that does accounts receivable software and does accounting and contracts and all of that, if there is an exposed rsync or if there is an exposed FTP, I can then check against that for all of the various keywords that I'm looking for and potentially export all of that information on LGC's contracts and on their client list and on their business, and in so doing, compromise them. And that's not something that company LGC would have control over, but it's something that they need to have insight into because they are in fact liable for it. So, and Paul, if you'd like to talk to us about the sort of third-party visibility gap that I began to touch on there.
Right. So, I mean, and great job, Brandon, kind of breaking down the various manifestations of third-party risk. Obviously, we're here to talk to you today because there's a problem, and I think the problem is that organizations have spent a couple of decades investing in security tools and solutions, that hated word, that do a great job at what they do, but they were really predicated on a very different type of problem and a very different type of computing environment, right? Sort of perimeterized, defined, on-premises, enterprise IT environments, what most security products and services out there are designed to protect, whether it's IDS, IPS, firewall, what have you. And increasingly, as you all know well, that's not the way your network looks, and it's not how your employees, consume and use services and the tools that they need to do their job. So many of you on the line have probably some kind of hybrid environment with those on-premises IT assets, application servers, and so on. But you're also probably relying on quite a number of cloud-based services, whether that's Office 365 or Slack or what have you. In addition, your employees are making use of services, consumerization of IT, whether that's cloud and whether that's Dropbox and tools like that. Maybe that's sanctioned by your IT group, maybe it isn't. But they're using them, and they're using them to do their job and be productive. The problem, of course, is that visibility and enforcement of IT security policies across that type of hybrid environment is really hard. And the bad guys know that, and they're taking advantage of it through a variety of ways. So, as Brandon mentioned, third-party service providers, managed service providers are really common. They're increasingly common. Brandon and I were both out at RSA, and managed security services, Brandon, I'm guessing you're going to agree with this, are very much in vogue right now, and a lot of people talking about outsourcing and switching to some kind of managed security service model, which is great. But managed service providers in various forms also really increase your risk. And I know the FBI just in January actually released a technical alert. It's TA 18276B. That was regarding specifically APT actors. This group Stone Panda from China, it's also known as APT10, that were compromising leading MSPs and really using their access to client networks to both compromise those networks and then, more importantly, to exfiltrate data. And, I think that's a really good use case for what you all need to be worried about with third-party risk. First of all, they're coming by way of a trusted partner. They're taking advantage of the trusted relationship between your organization and your managed service providers. They're increasingly, as the FBI said, called it living off the land, meaning they're using the tools that are there present on your network and that are used by your network administrators and so on, just to do their job in order to accomplish their mission, which is usually identifying and stealing sensitive information. In the case of APT10, that's things like, using command line tools, kind of standard Microsoft command line tools like Robocopy, or something. They used a PuTTY, secure copy client to do secure transfer of stolen information. So they're using the tools and techniques that a sysadmin might use, and the reason for that is that that's not going to set off alarms. That's not going to look unusual or out of place, especially in a very large network where there's a lot going on every day. And then using that trusted connection to the service provider to exfiltrate the data to a server, an asset that they control on the MSP, and from there, of course, to get it into a server that they actually own and control. So that's a really common scenario. The other, of course, as Brandon mentioned, just getting access to privileged accounts on your network, domain administrators, other types of admins, using spear phishing or business email compromise. We think of business email compromise in the context of like phony wire transfers. That's a pretty common scam where they pretend to be your CEO or CFO and tell you to, wire, $1 million into some random bank account. It actually works a fair amount, but it could be part of a longer play than that. It could be about getting access to certain assets or data, getting control of credentials, and so on. So those types of spear phishing attacks targeting layer 8 or your employees are really common. And obviously, to the extent that you're, working with managed service providers and third parties, again, huge productivity gains, huge business gains for you, but it also increases just the number of those privileged accounts on your network, right, that might be subject to compromise, and therefore it increases your risk. And it's not a reason not to use them, but it's something you do need to be aware of. So, just kind of, again, just to recap, cyber criminals, sophisticated and not as sophisticated, are definitely going to be targeting your supply chain, your network of managed service providers, your network of business partners, and even customers as a way to get into you. And we've seen a lot of examples of that. I note the recent attack on a company called Saipem that is a prominent Italian firm that services the oil and gas industry. It's just a big service provider to them. They got targeted not because, of course, the attackers were necessarily interested in them, but because of who their customers were, which were large oil and gas producers in the Middle East. So that's kind of the latest incarnation of the types of malicious activity that we've seen going back 6 or 7 years, targeting those individuals. Now, instead of going directly after the company, they're figuring out, who works with this company? Well, let's go after them. Let's follow the weakest link, and using that as a way to get access to or impact the target network. So, one of the really important things you need to consider, kind of from your perspective, is understanding what your exposure is, understanding what that universe of suppliers, partners, customers are that might impact your own risk. And that's kind of where threat intelligence comes in. And I'm gonna pass it back to Brandon, because he's gonna talk about how the proper application of threat intelligence can really help you get a grasp on what looks like a very squishy problem, which is third-party risk. Brandon, over to you.
Oh,
you're on mute.
Muted. Yep, muted it. Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Talk to yourself.
So I will take you guys through sort of 3 core components of how we actually look at, how we actually perform cyber risk assessment of our third parties. And throughout it, talk about how threat intelligence supports us here, specifically on the, really the technology side, and then acting as a force multiplier for the people. So cyber risk assessment of our third parties, it's growing. Like it's a growing space. As Paul mentioned, we were both at RSA a couple weeks back, and it blew me away the number of people walking around just desperate to know more about 3PRM, third-party risk monitoring. People were keying in on it from across the floor. And it's because I think people are really starting to understand that this is not just a risk and compliance concern. This is not just a procurement concern. This is not just a check the box concern. This is at its core an intel ops concern. So our third parties in this world where cyber is the new battlefield are our strategic assets. And that means that we need to look at them and treat them in a very similar way to how we look at ourselves. And one of the core ways to do this is by applying threat intelligence to it. So people understand now that this is a growing space and that it is a growing concern. They're asking, now what? What do I need to do about it? So these growing teams really need help in the process of engagement. What gets prioritized? Who gets contacted? How do they get contacted? When do they get contacted? On both the people side and the process side, we're seeing a real focus on, okay, I know I have a problem, but now what? It's why we're seeing a rise in things like SOAR, because it's allowing individuals who know they have a problem but don't necessarily know how to solve it to have a process for solving it and to automate the little things to get to an endpoint. So there needs to be both a means to prioritize as well as an output. So from a means to prioritize standpoint, people are turning to things like scoring. Because it's a sort of higher reliability mechanism than surveys, for example. Being able to say, okay, what is the view? What do the pieces of it mean? Are there indicators of compromise? Are there indicators of risk? What is the relative weighting of those indicators? If I have a botnet infection, it's far more important than if I just have an open port, because it means that I've already been dinged. But also, they're asking, what does that mean? Like, what do I do with that? So there's the one side, which is the scoring side, that says, okay, I know I have problems. How do I prioritize them? And then there's the informational side, the real threat intelligence side that says, for this problem, what does it mean and what do I do about it? And this can be looking at things like impact. What is the impact of the CVE? Remediation. How do I go about remediating it? Things like finished reports that you can pass off to the key parties that say, this is what your network looks like. Now go and fix these problems, and tracking time to remediate and all of those important pieces. So really being able to have a process in place and having a tool that supports you in building processes is remarkably important, because this is sort of a new domain. There are absolutely people in it. There are absolutely dedicated cyber risk assessment teams only looking at our third parties. But it's something that is rapidly growing because people have come to acknowledge that, oh my God, this is in fact a problem. My third parties are strategic assets, and the bad guys have realized it, and now I need to as well. those processes need to be informed by technology. So moving from an assumption here, but everybody on this call is in many ways connected to technology and understands the rapid rate of change of both technology and the internet. New CVEs are put out constantly. New exploits come out. There's constantly patching problems. There's constantly new means of access. And taking a point-in-time view really is not good enough. We need to have continuous monitoring, and it needs to be updated at the highest speeds possible, because that's the only way that we can actually keep up with the pace of the internet, because breaches keep pace with the internet. So, I really highlight surveys are no longer enough. Like, great, they give us controls or a general baseline, but we have to be taking a continuous view of a company's profile. And we also need to be verifying based on fact, because site visits and surveys and things like that are trust exercises. We need to trust, but we need to verify. We need to say, okay, I can see that these controls that you've been talking about are implemented, are in place, and are verified. Users need to be able to tune the view of the third party they're looking at to only the pieces that are relevant to them. And this is one that I really highlight on. Here at LookingGlass, we firmly believe that companies informed by threat intelligence have lower digital risk. Now, for data to become intelligence, it has to be contextualized to the end user. Otherwise, it's informative, but it's not really useful. So I'll bring up an example. IBM having 200,000 items in their NetLock is not relevant to me as somebody who IBM is my vendor. At the top end, maybe 3,000 of those items matter to me. And in actuality, it may come down to only a few IPs that are actually of concern. So having a generic score that says IBM is an F or a D or a C or what have you, because they control infrastructure for a bunch of people that is completely irrelevant to me, it's just noise. It's not intelligence. It's not contextualized. It may make you feel good to have a general view that says IBM good or IBM bad, but it's not something that you can actually action on. Another example is a lot of the cybersecurity companies, LookingGlass included. We actually run malware labs. We do extensive amounts of research into malware, and you see this with, Group 8200. You see this over at Palo Alto Networks with, I forget the name of their malware labs, and a bunch of the other cybersecurity companies. So if we are chasing alerts or refusing to work with these companies based on the fact that we can see a bunch of irrelevant APTs that are going through their malware labs, well, it's impacting the way that we can do business. And it also means that we're chasing alerts that aren't relevant or applicable or actionable, and are ultimately just noise. Beyond needing to be able to tune the view, we need to be able to take an external view. So this is how threat actors actually look at companies. If I put on my actor hat and I say, okay, I want to go and compromise a company like Oracle, well, what's the first thing that I would do? I would map their IP space. I would map their domain space. I would go use tools like Burp Suite and SQL Map. And then I would do scans against that. And I would see what are their open ports? What are their services that they're running? Do they have a downgraded software that's running that they may think is secure? Do they have exposed VPNs or single sign-on servers or FTP servers? All of these things. And that is how threat actors look at us. So in order to see these gaps and close them before the actors can take advantage of them, we need to be able to look at the world the same way that they do. So, and finally, there's a people problem. Like, this is just, it's a known fact, It's why there is a bit of a trend towards managed services, because it means, okay, I don't have to hire, I don't have to train, I don't have to do all these components for the end companies. And it's why there's a move towards, security automation, because automate what you can and build processes that untrained people can follow where you can't. Again, leaning back to RSA, we saw this in swim lanes rather public protest on behalf of cyber threat analysts, and choosing to protest around the understaffing and the fact that within the next couple of years, there's supposed to be a 3.5 million person shortage. People need a mechanism for prioritization of those incidents when they do come in. People need to be able to compare their third parties against each other based on their relative impact. That should say service manager, not product manager. But in this case, LookingGlass's solution actually comes with a program manager, a service manager, who acts as a force multiplier for your team, because we genuinely believe in this world in which there aren't enough people, and we need support to allow our people to do their job as well as possible. And on that note, Paul, I'll pass it back to you to talk about sort of third-party intelligence specifically.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is kind of and I think, again, kind of from the floor of RSA, I mean, this was a big issue for organizations, which is how to best make sense of their the data and the intelligence, or the information, I guess, that their security tools are providing to them. And, this is something that, companies are, obviously need to do, because it's leading cause of kind of burnout, or, important, even worse, maybe important information, important alerts kind of slipping through the filter and getting ignored or overlooked. And we've certainly seen, many examples of that, even going back to the sort of to the Target breach, right, which, arguably was partially the result of a missed alert. So, yeah, I mean, you need this complement of both skilled analysis and tools that make sense of, huge inflows of data. And increasingly, you need, what that really means for organizations is to prioritize, with the goal of really prioritizing what it is that your staff, whether they're your employees or they're part of a managed service provider, are devoting their time and energies to. That's where Brandon's talking about the kind of understanding what your third-party providers look like from the hacker's point of view and where those risks are. And that's true both for organizations you're already working with, you already have business ties to, and those that you might be considering doing business with or evaluating for a potential business relationship, right? You increasingly, it's no longer just about the service that they offer or what their price they're offering it at, but also what risk you take on as an organization by working with them. And, we see that all the time with, for example, point of sales providers, right? And there are a short list of those who do point of sales terminals and so on for organizations. But those are real targets for cyber criminals who want to steal credit card numbers, and real risk for organizations. Wendy's stores, the fast food chain, agreed to pay $50 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought not by customers, but by credit card issuers, linked to a point-of-sale breach at Wendy's restaurants in 2015 and 2016. And that exposed, data on millions of their customers. POS attacks and vulnerabilities are well known. Brandon and I could tell you that there have been presentations at conferences like Black Hat and DEF CON going back quite a ways, many years, kind of raising the alarm, raising the red flag around point-of-sale systems. But it's only until recently, I think, that the actual security of both hardware, software, and the whole POS ecosystem has become a top priority for retailers. Even though at the end of the day, it's the company's name and reputation, whether that's Target or Wendy's or whomever, Home Depot, that's ultimately going to take the hit. So you need to understand from a hacker's eye view, again, what the risk posture of those organization is. And, you know, that involves, that's a complex equation, and involves, as Brandon said, really taking a look at their public-facing IT assets, and then also things that, you know, might not be as easily verifiable, like, oh, they've got, you know, an open FTP connection here, or you know, they're, this application server is running an out-of-date version of whatever, WordPress. But it might be stuff that involves information that is, you know, in the dark web, in the cyber underground, stolen administrative credentials, stolen data that indicates or suggests that a compromise might have already taken place, and data already been exfiltrated from the organization. And of course, you know, just suspicious traffic, encrypted traffic going back and forth to the company. You know, they're in communication with, you know, domains or hosting providers that are known to be used by, you know, bad actors. You know, those are all relevant. None of them are necessarily smoking guns, but they're things that you want to know about and ask some hard questions and get the right answers, hopefully get the right answers to them as you're continuing to do business with the company, or ideally as you're vetting a company prior to engaging with them and giving them access to your own network and data and customer data and assets. So, and that's kind of really what we're talking about, is, you know, bringing that level of scrutiny to your operations, and not taking for granted that, okay, they filled out this checklist, or they answered our questions, and therefore we're just going to take them at their word, or we're going to assume that, you know, their security posture 3 weeks ago when they filled this out is still their security posture today, and it will be their security posture 6 months from now. You know, as Brandon said, this is an ongoing thing. You need continuous evaluation, continuous scrutiny on these, not kind of point in time snapshots of what a customer's risk posture is. So with that, we'd like to open the lines. It's almost like we're doing like a call-in show, to questions from the audience. And there is a QA feature here on the BrightTalk platform. We encourage you to do it. It's not that often that you have somebody like Brandon, who is a really knowledgeable, experienced cybersecurity expert, threat intelligence expert, there to answer your questions. So if you've got them, ask them. And do we have any ready to go?
We do, Paul. We've got a couple that have come through. So as Paul mentioned, you guys can go ahead and still submit. We've got about 12 more minutes in our webcast today. So I'm going to take these from the top. Here's one that came through. Let's see. First question. Where does the data come from that provides insights into these networks? Brandon?
That's a great question. So I'll touch on that in two parts. First and foremost, the sort of the network topology information, and then the threat intelligence information. So the network topology information actually comes down to sort of where LookingGlass came from, where our origin is. So we began mapping the public-facing internet based off of ARIN data, BGP route data, WHOIS information, as an MSA project that ultimately got commercialized. And it was really with a focus on exactly those three things, sort of building out this picture of the public-facing internet by focusing on who the announced owners are on one level, you know, who owns the actual announcers or the unoutsiders, but also who are IPs, CIDRs, domains, everything like that underneath the announcement owned by as well. So it's really a picture that is on two levels, one from the registration data for ARIN and stuff, and then also from who specifically we see assets belong to. From the threat intel side, we actually produce our own threat feeds. I think we have something like 17 proprietary feeds in-house that look at everything from you know, malware, command and control servers, phishing. We look into the newly registered domains that come from the zone files over at ICANN. We also bring in about 88 feeds on top of that cover the full domain of indicators, from indicators of compromise and indicators of risk. I know we talk about all 13 or 14 threat types specifically that we're looking at on our website. So if you are curious about that, I recommend going and taking a look.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Here's another one that's come through. Let's see. You say continuous monitoring is important. How often are you updating your threat data?
So that's a great question as well. So we actually are loading in the threat intelligence feeds from various sources every 15 minutes, which, as far as I'm aware, and as far as I've touched on and found out from, talking to customers and market interviews, is the closest to continuous monitoring that you get in this industry. That being said, our threat intelligence feeds themselves don't all update at that rate. It can be anywhere from 15 minutes to a few hours to even a few days. But as the information is coming in, we are loading it as quickly as we can, and bringing it in and contextualizing it against these networks that matter to you. So for us, we say every 15 minutes.
Great info. Okay, here's another one that just came through. Let's see. How are you differentiated from more traditional scorecard companies?
So that's a great question. I think the big one that I always lean on, there's three that I always lean on. The first one is, what I just brought up, that rate at which we are bringing in information. We really started as an Intel Ops company, not as a GRC or not as a risk or compliance one. So we approached the problem a little bit differently. We focused on bringing in sort of top quality threat intelligence as quickly as possible. And doing it in Intel Ops fashion. This asset belongs to this individual, has this threat on it, and that's what that means. With no black boxing, with no pieces taken out, just really explicitly, this is the problem, and this is what that problem means, and this is why we see that it's assigned to someone. The second piece is from a scoring standpoint. We firmly believe that scoring should not be black box. It's not just a generic score. It's based on specific information that we make visible to the customer, and then we actually even allow them to alter based on their own personal risk profile. So things like what the source was, where the threat came from, how the threat is classified, how different pieces of the internet actually can interact with each other based off of how packets route, all of these things. So it's a very different approach to how we look at threats and prioritize threats. And then finally, the tuned view of the networks. So we're, at least for now, somewhat unique in how we approached it, being able to build these very specific, very granular views down to only the IPs or domains that matter to you, as opposed to a generic or total view of the company or the third party in question. We highlight that we're looking at collections, not at companies, because they're collections of network elements that are relevant to you. They're not just the total sort of irrelevant view of the company.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
Brandon, I wanted to sort of ask you a question or interject a question that I think maybe some of the attendees might be wondering, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the big, and I'm sure you'll agree, one of the big scenarios around third-party exposure that we see is what we see from like Chris Vickery and UpGuard, right? Which is, unprotected or loosely protected Amazon S3 storage buckets or some other kind of cloud storage repository that ends up getting indexed and these kind of massive troves of data. Maybe it's a backup or data that's been shared with a third party for let's say marketing campaign or something like that. Just kind of hanging out there unprotected. It's not on the company's network. It's data that they entrusted to somebody else, and then it got exposed through them and via like just a really insecure cloud instance. it's a really thorny problem. I'd be interested in like your thoughts on what the best way to respond to that as a company is, and try and get your arms around like, man, are we exposed to that type of risk?
Yeah, so it is definitely a thorny problem, and it's one that's going to keep coming up. Yeah, you called out S3 buckets there. Another one I would call out is the GitHub ones. And it's unfortunate because the same discovery tools that people like us would use to realize that there are things exposed are the ones that bad guys would use to find it as well. So Amazon with their APIs and how they're looking at it and how they're trying to lock down on automated scanning and stuff like that. And GitHub, how they've really limited their API for being able to scan their repos. They're actually, on one hand, it's a great thing because they're looking at the security of the company and trying to prevent bad guys from being able to do it. On the other hand, it's actually making it even harder for companies, for example, like our own to discover that. It's a problem that right now there isn't a great solution for. I know, looking into our own version of the solution, I know there are other people who are doing it, but what it's coming down to right now is there needs to be an active investigation component that goes and audits this. I know we do it through our GSI group, as part of our CASA, look at what the exposed surface is, and that's taking our sort of expert analysts that have been on site and supporting the Fortune 50 for going on 20 years now on surveillance side, and putting them on the problem as a human solution. That's not something that long-term is going to scale, so we're looking at better ways to automate it and ways to identify the risk points. But at least in the short term, we need to be more careful when we're setting up and doing our configuration, and that goes back to not just doing the Google steps, if you will. Two, we need to know what our attack surface is. So we need to be able to build out an attack surface that says, okay, all of these domains host on AWS, and this is your bucket, and it's in S3, and this is what it looks like. And then we need to have an active component until there's an automated component that says, oh, by the way, this is misconfigured, and in this way you're exposed.
Right. Right. Good advice. Good thoughts.
Good thoughts. Okay, there's one more really quick. I think we've got a couple minutes. We'll see if we can get this one in, Brandon. It says, what do you mean by 3PRM monitoring being an interlope concern? Can you address that?
Oh, I think they were saying Intel ops there. So 3PRM being an Intel ops concern, as opposed to more of a risk and compliance one. So this is something that I really do highlight on, and I love the fact that the more conversations I have with threat intelligence people, the more their eyes are lighting up and they're going, yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So it used to be that monitoring our third parties came down to, as we said, just those site surveys, came down to just doing visits, checking the box, if you will. You just did it because in saying you did it, you lowered your liability. But that's not really the case anymore, because the impact of our third parties being breached from a cyber standpoint specifically is just too high. One, we as companies are actually carrying the onus of when our third parties are breached. I'll use Hyatt as an example. Hyatt was breached through their point of sale provider, but they were still fined and held accountable because the point of sale provider lost PII that was relevant to Hyatt. So on the one hand, we are actually accountable for what happens to our third parties. And on the other, because from a cyber standpoint, we are so interconnected and things can spread laterally, we can have a lot of damage done to us from a cyber standpoint. So yeah, I would say that's it. From a cyber standpoint, from a world where cyber is the battlefield, our third parties are strategic assets. We need to take the same threat intelligence stance in looking at them that we need to look at ours, because the impact is just as high. It's not just a check the box thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. All right, gentlemen, I believe we are almost to the top of the hour, so I think that wraps up this portion of today's webcast. And I want to let the audience know, if you would like a chance to get a deeper dive into our third-party risk monitoring solutions and to meet Brandon and other subject matter experts, please be sure to check out the link in the attachment section. And and it'll also be included in a follow-up email from our team. But we are hosting a LookingGlass Digital Business Risk Roadshow. We'll come into different cities around the nation, so please check that information out. It is a free half-day symposium where you can earn 3 hours of CPE credit and learn new perspectives on protecting your business from risk emanating outside your network. But thank you, Brandon and Paul, for today's informative presentation, and thanks to our audience for attending today. A link to the recordings of our webinar will be sent out to each of you following the webcast, and also will be made available on our website under our webinars pages for additional viewing. Feel free to pass this along and share this presentation with your colleagues. And our final screen right here has some contact information for the LookingGlass team in case you would like to reach out to us, our social media, as well as our website. But Paul and Brandon, again, thank you both for your informative presentation today.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, everyone who dialed in.
Thanks, Dina, and thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.